Have I been a little distracted lately? Have I maybe given in to some temptation in my last month before going back to full-time employment and then given into sleepiness as I sink into a 9 to 5? Do I maybe have some other thoughts I've been letting percolate while I decide whether I even have anything to say about Resident Evil like I promised I would way back in, what was that, June? Yes, to all of the above. I've been hunting monsters, I've hunted bugs, I've read about aliens, and I've even written and filmed just a smidge about them, as you may have noticed. I've defended Naruhodo Ryunosuke, and I've matched wits with the daring Herlock Sholmes, although I didn't join him for a tea time with
Ricky Rouse and Ronald Muck.
But notably, I've also been playing Resident Evil, and playing it obsessively, like I've done for most of my life. I have very few things that stay fresh for me each time I read, watch, or play them, and yet I can't count how many times I've played and replayed each Resident Evil game. For most of them, it's easily in the dozens, and even for the worst ones, it's at least 2. Okay. I haven't gone back and replayed Resident Evil Revelations, or ever played Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D, but let's maybe shelve some of the spin-off titles for purposes of this video. It will probably be obvious shortly why we might want to ignore those games. So, I'm finally ready to declare what makes Resident Evil such a great series in all its iterations. But first, we have to define... Oh, okay. Fine, maybe it's not a definition section this time, but I want to walk through what I consider the pivotal twists and turns in the history of Resident Evil to help make sense of its through line. I'll be brief, I swear. So, first, we had Resident Evil 1996, or, if you prefer, Resident Evil Director's Cut, or hell, even Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition if you really want to go that deep. It defined the next, well, at least the next 2 Resident Evils, which followed the classic sequel mold of
more, bigger, better. It's the secret of sequels.
RE's 1, 2, and 3 were all essentially the same type of gameplay where a 3D polygonal character clunked around with tank controls, shooting or weaving their way through some kind of convoluted series of elaborate puzzle rooms and increasingly deadly monsters. These environs were all pre-rendered backgrounds, rendered at excruciatingly low resolutions, so that they could fit onto 1 or 2 of the PlayStation's little black discs, along with a couple minutes of FMV cutscenes and a surprising amount of extremely campy English language voiceovers.
Behind their escape was the lone survivor of the Raccoon City Police Department.
Capcom's first big leap in evolving the series was Resident Evil Code Veronica, which I went on about at length in one of my last videos. Needless to say, the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. While the Dreamcast allowed the team to render 3D backgrounds in real time, the game still played essentially identically to those earlier titles, with tank controls and fixed cameras and low-res cutscenes tickling all the fuzzy nostalgia of their players. The formula didn't really evolve with the next 2 games to come out either, Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil Zero. While both games' graphics were a huge step up in terms of eerie fidelity, they were both intentionally callbacks to the very first game. Now they could say the controls were definitely clunky and awful on purpose, and flesh out some concepts they'd toyed around with while prototyping the game, such as letting players control more than one character at a time, and forcing players to re-kill zombies if they didn't decapitate or burn them first. Now comes the interesting part. After a lot of indecision, scrapping, and reworking of ideas, Capcom finally released Resident Evil 4 for the Nintendo GameCube. Unlike every mainline Resident Evil before it, this game was not only sick as hell, but metal as fuck. The player character could not only pull off deadly headshots and whip his knife out on a whim, but he could suplex and flip kick his way past obscene numbers of far too human creatures. There were giants towering over Leon Kennedy, and not just as a final boss. There were robe-wearing crossbowmen, there were friggin' machine gunners, I mean, come on! Needless to say, fans were divided on this new take on the series. I fell in love with it instantly, but I certainly didn't go and burn all my old Resident Evil games in effigy and declare the end of an era. Many fans of the series felt this 40-plus hour masterpiece of action horror was somehow a sacrilege against their sacred texts that came before it. Where were the fixed camera angles, they asked? How can I be scared when I'm flip-kicking dogs in the face? What happened to careful and considerate management of key items while you solve elaborate puzzle rooms? Well, to be honest, there was a lot of continuity brought over to this new iteration in the franchise, but, to be fair to haters, it was occasionally dumbed down and neatly hidden under a veneer of campy action fun that, unlike previous entries, was not confined solely to goofy FMVs and a terrible voice acting. I can, and maybe will, draw parallels and highlight callbacks that were neatly intertwined in almost every second of RE4. Much like Aliens, I consider it among the elite tier of perfect sequels, accommodating and even welcoming newcomers to the franchise while also perpetually winking at and relying on the expectations of the returning fans. Am I saying you're a stupid fan for not getting just how deep RE4's reverence for the classic games goes? Yes I am. To our great surprise, the thing Capcom wanted to focus on after this was cooperative play, which is a really weird thing for a horror franchise to focus on. Nonetheless, Capcom pressed on by essentially reskinning Resident Evil 4 as a co-op shooter and calling it Resident Evil 5. Although the game made a jump to the next generation of consoles, little else changed in this entry, and the RE4 haters therefore still had plenty to complain about. Then, disaster struck. Resident Evil 6 was the bloated catastrophe of the series, where Capcom clearly learned all the wrong lessons from Resident Evils 4 and 5. Those games were top sellers of all time, so of course they wanted to imitate that success. However, they decided what people really liked about those games was the focus on action, the shooting, the cooperative gameplay, campy cinematics, and being way too fucking long. Accordingly, they made the biggest, baddest, campiest, cooperativeliest mess they possibly could, and nearly killed the franchise with their underperforming overproduction. What is a franchise to do when it fucks up its sales projections so badly? Well, in Hollywood, it would definitely be time for a reboot, so many fans expected Resident Evil 7 to either never come out or completely reinvent the series yet again. The intervening 5 years saw the death of another proud horror series with the underperformance of Dead Space 3, and the near rebirth of the Silent Hill franchise into a claustrophobic first-person experience, with the release and unfortunate subsequent withdrawal of the PS3's PT, or Playable Teaser. While Capcom loves to reuse its own ideas most of all, they were not above a little inspiration from their peers. Accordingly, they moved away from the bombastic cooperative experience that had doomed Dead Space 3 and Resident Evil 6, and instead released a playable teaser of their own, showcasing a first-person, weapons-free experience for the forthcoming Resident Evil 7. At that point in my life, I loved this demo, but was very skeptical. It was such an obvious ripoff of PT, I couldn't help but feeling that Capcom had really lost the thread on the whole series. Thankfully, it turned out that the game wasn't just being crapped out to respond to market trends, and the team released the thoughtful return to form that we all know and love as Resident Evil 7. It started to blend some of the elements of Resident Evils 4 and 5 back into the original game's formula, leading to a slower, toned down, and slightly dour re-entry into the franchise. I've already talked about Resident Evil 8 a bit, but prepare for some more because I think it neatly highlights the through line of the whole series. It's where they tried to dial up the action again while still focusing on what should have been the primary goals of Resident Evil since the very beginning. So yes, Resident Evil and Resident Evil 4 are very different games. While one of them involves elaborate knife fights and acrobatically defeating a laser grid, and the other mostly involves walking past shambling corpses, they both still work hard at making players scared. Although Resident Evil 4 requires a little more twitch action and reaction, they both still have intentionally awkward controls that create pulse-pounding danger for the player, where there might not have been any in a game like, let's say, Fear 2. They both successfully combine their horror elements, e.g. the scary-looking monsters, with gameplay mechanics that make those horror elements, well, actually scary. What good is a terrifying villain if it can't do anything to you? Like, any seasoned Resident Evil fan is going to know when they see a hunter, oh shit, I could be decapitated any second and lose all of my progress. Yes, the hunters are gone in RE4, but the replacement chainsaw maniacs are no less fear-inspiring for exactly the same reason as hunters. They can take you down completely in just a few stray moments of inattention. All the good Resident Evils also noticeably force you to consider your save points, and threaten you with the ultimate punishment, lost progress. By making the player take stock and manually save, whether it be by ink ribbon or chapter chapter ending, they both give the player a short window to be relieved from the fear of death, and reinforce that later fear of death by spacing save points out. Now, that's not to say it's impossible to be afraid when your progress is saved automatically, but the less you think about how much you stand to lose when you die, the less afraid you'll be of dying. The less afraid you are of dying, the less likely you are to be afraid in-game at all. The limited inventory is, in my opinion, one of the most crucial tools they use in all of the good Resident Evil games. In RE1, your characters are restricted to either 4 or 6 item slots to start, and can pick up an extra couple slots as they go along. And this means that, at worst, if you're playing as Chris and carrying around a health spray and a key item needed to progress, you've got room for a gun, or maybe a gun and some ammo for that gun. Deciding what gun to bring not only becomes an interesting decision for the player, but it also lets them control how risky their excursion is. They could free up some space and leave ammo behind, but if they run out and find themselves cornered, that's
game over, man! Game over!
The same thing happens when they're choosing whether they need a health spray to survive a few chomps along the way, or if they're willing to go scout out some new route in hopes of finding some health items or bullets along the way. Essentially, it makes exploration feel scary, not only because of the fear of losing resources like ammo, but also because of the fear of losing the time invested in progression. Now, Resident Evils 4 through 8 don't really force players to keep track of their key items anymore, but they still notably put limitations on what players can carry. RE4 and 8's attaché case system put the focus on what kinds of ammo or guns you can carry, which thankfully works well with those games' more action-forward horror. When you're in the middle of a firefight with an endless stream of baddies, what's going to make you nervous? That's right, running out of the wrong ammo at the wrong time. So, while they've somewhat reduced the scariness of limited item space over time, they've managed to hold on to a functional equivalent of this wonderful dramatic tool, even today. And believe me, that feeling of resource management still haunted me through my first Resident Evil 8 playthrough. I had the luxury of playing it almost completely blind with no clue what lay ahead of me, and found myself furiously hoarding bullets just as if I were still in Resident Evil 1. Every new gun I got, I struggled with the decision of what to keep and what to sell. I guzzled down every bit of health juice I could squeeze out of the environment, and you know what? There was little in gaming as scary as facing a seemingly endless army of werewolves and Frankenstein's monsters, while absolutely positive I'd run out of my deadly rifle ammo any second. I hope it's obvious by this point that what Resident Evil games really excel at and are trying to do at every turn, with every tool in their belt, is scare a new player and then empower a repeat player. Scaring and then empowering is a method I see a lot in the Alien movies too, and I think it's what really fosters a sense of connection in horror fans and gets them to suspend their disbelief and really put themselves in the shoes of horror protagonists. In Alien, and even more prominently in Aliens, the films spend a majority of their time putting protagonists through the ringer and then paying it all off with an explosive defeat of the big bads. Similarly, the very first Resident Evil forces a new player to wander around for anywhere between 4 and 12 hours, putting crests into obscure holes or rotating cave walls out of their way, before rewarding them with even more tension by making them fight the biggest, baddest creature around, with a time limit and very unclear chances of victory. At first glance, it's not much like the empowerment of Aliens at all. However, unlike a movie, a game doesn't have to end when the credits roll. While Aliens needs to cram Ripley's redemption and badassery into the last leg of the film, Resident Evil gives Jill or Chris their chance for revenge by insisting that they go back and take another crack at the haunted mansion. By this time, a player is empowered not by power armor or flamethrowers, but by knowledge. Knowledge that the zombies are slow, and knowledge of what parts of the map they're going to return to, or what weapons they can leave behind at what parts of the game. And guess what? Those players bold enough to speedrun the game don't just get the smug satisfaction of having mastered the previously terrifying. They also get access to silly costumes and infinite ammo weapons, literally empowering them to make a mockery of the tense atmospheric dread they've just conquered. It shouldn't be a shock that doing well at the game makes it easier, but Resident Evil takes an extra step and makes it exponentially easier for skilled players to run rings around the formerly spooky sets. Every one of these games has some sort of reward for the diligent replayers of the game, and that's because this is a horror experience. A vital part of the catharsis in a horror experience is overcoming your fear. Some people theorize it's why we enjoy horror movies at all, by taking the chance to experience fear in a safe environment and overcome it, or at least survive it. Video games put players even more in the shoes of their protagonists, and so the danger feels more real and therefore more scary than any mere movie, with its impermeable fourth wall, ever could. Is Resident Evil my favorite series of all time? Sadly, no. I think the Golden Era Silent Hills do everything Resident Evil does but better. More subtly, more artistically, and more profoundly. It also has the profoundly superior soundscape, thanks to the brilliance of Akira Yamaoka. But I also think Resident Evil has succeeded in ways that few other horror games and series ever have. While it's let me down before, the letdowns were so few and far between, and the heights were so high that I'm an indefatigable fan. But feel free to tell me just how wrong I am down in the comments. The algorithm must feed, and only your engagement can satisfy its hunger. You may have noticed I'm taking longer and longer to do anything, and my efforts are a little more footage-based. That's because I'm back to working full-time, and I am but a feeble, easily exhausted man. So, if you want me to quit my job and get back to pumping out content for your joy full-time, I'm gonna need a hell of a lot more engagement to make that worthwhile. At the moment, I'm entirely laboring for the love of the game, and my heart is tiny, shriveled, and utterly inadequate at containing love. Take my videos and make them go viral, or I will continue to hold your content hostage. That is all. Thanks, I love you, bye-bye!